Picture this. The guns have fallen silent across Europe. The air, thick with the dust of ruined cities, carries a heavy stillness. Canadian soldiers, exhausted but victorious, stand ready to accept the surrender. But then, the unthinkable happens. A German major, against all military logic, against the very reality of a defeated nation, refuses to lay down his arms. This isn't a story about the final battle of World War II. It's about the first terrifying moment of the peace. Our story today unravels this single, breathtaking act of defiance. We'll journey back to the battlefields where Canadian forces first tasted the brutality of modern warfare in Europe. We'll explore the rigid, honor-bound traditions of the German officer corps, a mindset that could value duty over life itself. This is a clash, not just of armies, but of ideals. The pragmatic duty of the victors versus the unyielding code of the vanquished. What drove this major to make such a choice when surrender was the only sane option? We'll dissect the Canadian soldiers' shock and confusion. Their orders were clear, but the man in front of them was rewriting the rules. How do you respond when the enemy won't accept they've lost? We'll delve into the split-second moral and legal dilemmas that erupted in that tense standoff, a decision that would echo for decades. This single event forces us to question everything we think we know about the end of a war. The consequences of that moment ripple far beyond the battlefield. We'll examine how this incident influenced our collective memory of the war, how it challenged and shaped international laws of conflict, and how it continues to make us question human behavior under the most extreme pressure. It's a stark reminder that the end of fighting doesn't mean the end of difficult choices. Ultimately, this story isn't about victory or defeat. It's a profound lesson from history. It teaches us that even when the world is plunged into darkness, every action has a consequence, and individuals are forever bound by the choices they make. It proves that history is never simply black and white, but a complex tapestry of human decisions lived out in shades of gray. From a distance, seeing a German officer refuse to surrender while completely surrounded might just look like stubbornness or even fanaticism. But to truly understand why a German major would make that choice, we need to wind back the clock and explore the mindset that created men like him, men who believed military honor was far more important than their own survival. In the German army of World War II, particularly the Wehrmacht, officers were more than just tactical commanders. They were molded from a young age to embody discipline, absolute authority, and the core concept of flick duty. For a major, his rank wasn't just a patch on his uniform. It was a lifelong commitment to the army, to the nation, and, within Nazi Germany, to an ideology where sacrifice was seen as inevitable. Before the war, German military academies forged a generation of officers who believed surrender was only an option when fighting was completely impossible. And even then, it was considered a permanent stain on their honor. The lessons from Germany's defeat in World War I and the harsh Treaty of Versailles were constantly drilled into them as a warning. Surrender was on just the end of a battle. It was the start of national collapse. With this deeply ingrained belief, many German officers saw death on the battlefield as a much less humiliating fate than laying down their weapons. The major that the Canadian soldiers were facing wasn't some crazed individual. He was a typical product of this very system. His service record would likely show that mid-level officers like him had fought on multiple fronts from Poland and France to Italy and Normandy. They had seen both overwhelming victory and devastating defeat, and were used to making life-or-death decisions for hundreds of soldiers. It was this experience that made them believe that if they could just hold out for a few more hours or a few more days, the situation might turn around. At the very least, they would have fulfilled their duty to the bitter end. For this major, surrendering to the Canadians wasn't just about accepting his own personal defeat. It meant admitting that the entire value system he had lived his life by and fought for was meaningless. In that moment of encirclement, surrounded by crumbling walls and the fading sounds of gunfire, he chose to cling to the only thing he had left, the authority of a commanding officer. Now, let's shift our perspective to the Canadian soldiers. They didn't see an ideological symbol or a complex military doctrine. What they saw was a man in a German uniform, a man still capable of giving orders and still capable of causing more casualties if the fight continued. The stark difference in military cultures became painfully obvious. While Canadian soldiers were taught that surrender was a legitimate part of war, a way to save lives and end the violence, this major viewed it as completely unacceptable. The long, tense silence between the two sides wasn't just a pause in the battle. It was a chasm between two completely different worldviews. Every second that ticked by increased the risk of more bloodshed. And it was in this charged atmosphere that the Canadian soldiers started to realize something profound. They weren't just facing one man. They were facing an entire system of belief, a rigid ideology that was baked into every single decision the man in front of them made. It was a clash not just of armies, but of entire philosophies of war, duty, and life itself. When we see a German officer refusing to surrender, even when completely surrounded, it's easy to dismiss it as simple stubbornness or even fanaticism. But to truly understand why a German major would make that choice, we need to rewind the clock and look at the ideology that forged men like him. Men who believed military honor was worth more than life itself. In the German army of World War II, especially the Wehrmacht officers were more than just tactical commanders. From a young age, they were molded to embody discipline, absolute authority, and the core concept of flicked duty. For a major, his rank wasn't just a badge on his shoulder. It was a lifelong pact with the army, the nation, and the prevailing ideology that viewed sacrifice as a necessary, even noble conclusion. German military academies before the war had groomed an entire generation of officers to believe that surrender was only an option when all possibility of fighting was gone. And even then, it was seen as a permanent stain on their reputation. The lessons of Germany's defeat in World War I and the humiliating Treaty of Versailles were hammered home as a cautionary tale. Surrender was not just the end of a battle. It was the start of national collapse. With this ingrained belief, many German officers saw death on the battlefield as a far less shameful fate than laying down their arms. The major that the Canadian soldiers faced was not some unhinged madman. He was a typical product of this very system. His service record would likely show he was a seasoned veteran, having fought on multiple fronts from Poland and France to Italy and Normandy. He had tasted both glorious victory and bitter defeat. He was accustomed to making life-or-death decisions for hundreds of men under his command. And it was this experience that fueled his belief that if he could just hold out for a few more hours, a few more days, the situation might miraculously turn around. At the very least, he would have fulfilled his duty to the absolute end. For this major, surrendering to the Canadians wasn't just about accepting personal defeat. It was admitting that the entire value system he had lived, fought, and killed for was meaningless. In that moment of encirclement, with walls crumbling around him and the sounds of gunfire fading, he chose to cling to the only thing he had left: the authority of a commanding officer. Now, let's shift perspective and see this through the eyes of the Canadian soldiers. They didn't see an ideological symbol or a complex military doctrine. What they saw was a man in a German uniform who was still capable of giving orders and inflicting casualties if the fighting resumed. Here, the clash of military cultures becomes painfully clear. While Canadian soldiers were taught that surrender was a valid part of war, a way to save lives and end violence, this major viewed it as a betrayal of everything he stood for. The long, tense silence that hung between the two sides wasn't just a lull in the fighting. It was a vast chasm between two completely different worldviews. Every second that ticked by heightened the risk of more bloodshed. And in this unbearable tension, the Canadian soldiers began to grasp a difficult truth. They weren't just confronting one man. They were facing an entire system of thought, a rigid ideology that was hardwired into every single decision the man in front of them made. In the heat of battle, rules can feel like a distant memory. Before World War II began, nations gathered in quiet halls across Europe, signing documents like the Geneva Conventions. They made a promise. Even in the chaos of war, a shred of humanity could be preserved. But for a group of Canadian soldiers facing a defiant German major, that promise was about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. Picture this. The fight has been fierce, and the tide is turning. A German officer stands before the Canadians, but he refuses to surrender. He's still armed, still in command. According to the rules, a soldier who expresses an intention to surrender should be protected. But what happens when that intention is not just absent, but actively denied? In that split second, the heavy burden of international law falls squarely on the shoulders of frontline soldiers. Men who have no time to consult a lawyer or read through clauses. They are the judge, jury, and potentially the executioner. This situation was a direct clash of philosophies. Canadian soldiers were trained that the ultimate goal wasn't annihilation, but to make the enemy stop fighting. They had a reputation for accepting surrenders, for taking prisoners even when it was risky. But war teaches hard lessons. They had seen comrades fall for feigned surrenders, ambushes disguised as capitulation. That bitter experience bred caution. So, when this German major stood his ground, it wasn't just one man's defiance. It was a challenge to the very core of their beliefs. If they tried to persuade him further, they risked more of their own lives. Another sniper's bullet, another hidden grenade. Every second they hesitated was a gamble with their friend's safety. But if they opened fire, they would have to live with the knowledge that they killed a man who, perhaps, could have been captured. There was no perfectly right answer. There was only the least wrong choice in a situation pushed to its absolute limit. Imagine the tension in that moment. The unspoken glances between the soldiers, the slight tremble in a finger resting on a trigger, the heavy silence, thick with indecision. This wasn't about heroism or glory. It was about a profound conflict between the laws of war and the primal instinct to survive. The soldiers knew their decision would be written down in a battle report, but more importantly, it would be etched into their own conscience for the rest of their days. In that quiet, tense standoff, the true nature of war is laid bare. It's not a grand spectacle of heroic charges and clear-cut victories. It's a collection of impossible, imperfect choices made by ordinary people under extraordinary pressure. When that moment finally passed and a decision was made, none of those men could ever go back to being who they were before. They were forever changed by the encounter with the officer who refused to surrender. A stark reminder that the deepest wounds of war are often invisible. In the war-torn towns of southern Europe during the brutal Italian campaign, the line between attack and defense blurred into nothing. For the Canadian Army, advancing through shattered streets was a slow, agonizing process. They fought house by house, room by room, where every corner could hide a new threat. It was in one of these ruined buildings that a brief negotiation came to a dead end. The battlefield leaves no time for hesitation. A German major cornered with his men refused the call to surrender. In that cramped, volatile space, his refusal wasn't a matter of distant strategy. It was an immediate life-or-death threat. To the Canadian soldiers facing him, he wasn't just an officer following orders. He was an active combatant, and his position was still a hotbed of resistance. The orders that followed were short, stripped of any emotion. When the major kept his weapon raised and his men remained armed, the situation was defined by the cold, unforgiving logic of war. The decision to open fire wasn't an act of rage, but a calculated response born from a grim assessment of risk, responsibility, and their own survival. The gunfire that erupted wasn't a triumphant sound. It was a harsh, percussive blast that echoed off crumbling plaster, followed by a silence more terrifying than the noise itself. As the dust settled, the standoff was over. The German officer who had chosen defiance could no longer make any choice at all. His men, shocked into submission, finally laid down their weapons. The camera in this story doesn't focus on the action, but on what came after: the faces of the Canadian soldiers. There were no cheers, no victorious gestures, only a deep, bone-crushing weariness and a complicated, unspoken feeling. They had done what military necessity demanded, but the human cost hung heavy in the air. That profound silence spoke volumes more than any words could. In the official battle report, the incident was likely recorded as a neutralized pocket of resistance, a tactical success. But war's true story isn't written in reports. It's etched into the memories of those who were there. It lives on in the long, quiet nights after the fighting stops, when the haunting question of what if begins to echo. Was there another way? Could a few more seconds of patience have changed the outcome and saved a life? Or would that same hesitation have cost the lives of their own comrades? This moment reveals a stark truth about warfare. Rules of engagement and personal morality can only guide you so far, when every option is fraught with terrible consequences. Soldiers are forced to act on a fragile mix of training, instinct, and the overwhelming duty to protect the person next to them. And once that choice is made, there is no going back. It's in moments like these that the simple black-and-white narrative of war begins to fracture. The clear lines between hero and villain, right and wrong, dissolve into a gray landscape of impossible choices, each one leaving its own scar. For those Canadian soldiers, their confrontation with the German major wasn't just the end of a small battle. It was the beginning of a psychological burden they would carry long after the war was over. The image of that defiant officer and the choice they were forced to make would become a permanent part of their own history. A reminder that in war victory is never clean, and the heaviest wounds are often the ones no one can see. After the last shot was fired, the battle didn't end. It just changed form. For the Canadian soldiers who had just faced the German major, the physical war was over, but a silent administrative one was just beginning. This is where the raw, chaotic reality of combat gets translated into the sterile language of reports and reviews, where human memory clashes with the official record. Within hours, the combat report was filed, as procedure dictates. The language was precise, clinical, and stripped of all emotion. It read something like this: a pocket of enemy resistance was encountered. An order to surrender was given. The enemy refused. Lethal force was used to neutralize the threat. On paper, it's a clean, straightforward event. There's no room for the real-life hesitation, the split-second decisions, or the moral weight of the moment. It's just another entry in the ledger of war. For the higher command, this incident was just one of many. They viewed it through the detached lens of military law and operational effectiveness. At the time, an officer who refused to surrender while still in command of his troops was unconsidered a prisoner of war. Therefore, the use of force against him was deemed legitimate. There was no formal investigation, no trial, no public outcry. From an institutional perspective, the case was closed almost as soon as it happened. The machinery of war simply doesn't have time to dwell on any single event for too long. But while the official records fell silent, the minds of the men who were there did not. The Canadian soldiers who witnessed the major's final moments were left to process it on their own. Many later said what struck them most was the quiet composure of their superiors. There were no reprimands, but also no praise. Just a silent, unspoken acceptance that this is what war demands. For some, this institutional neutrality was a comfort, a sign that they had acted correctly. For others, it created a profound void, leaving them with an experience they couldn't name or understand. They were left alone with their memories. In the years following the war, as soldiers began to write their memoirs and give interviews, stories like this one were rarely shared in detail. It wasn't necessarily because they were taboo, but because they didn't fit the simplified narratives of war that the public wanted. Society craves stories of clear-cut heroes and villains, decisive victories and noble defeats. These moments of murky, ambiguous morality, where the lines are blurred, are often pushed to the sidelines of our collective memory. They're uncomfortable, and they complicate the clean stories we tell ourselves about conflict. The story of the German major who refused to surrender became a classic example of how history gets flattened. The event exists in the archives, but it's a skeleton without flesh, lacking the emotional depth and the human perspective of those on the ground. This is why many veterans would only speak of such moments in hushed tones, in private conversations with trusted comrades. Far from the judgment of a public that couldn't possibly understand, they could admit their internal conflict without fear of being misunderstood. And so, we're left with a paradox. Militarily and legally, the incident was resolved. The paperwork was filed, the rules were followed, and the war moved on. But for the human beings involved, the story was far from over. The silence of the official record didn't erase the memory, it just buried it deeper. There, in the quiet corners of their minds, it would continue to shape their understanding of war, of themselves, and of the world for the rest of their lives. When the fighting stops on the battlefield, it doesn't mean the war's over. For the human mind, it's often just the beginning. Imagine this: Canadian soldiers facing a German major who refuses to surrender. A single tense moment. Then, it's done. But when those soldiers returned home, that moment wasn't celebrated as a victory or even discussed as a mistake. It just lingered a heavy silence in their memory, a constant question with no easy answer. Years later, we've started to understand that these moments are ones where soldiers make life or death moral decisions under extreme pressure, leave the deepest scars. It's not always the big, loud battles that haunt them. For many Canadian veterans, their restless nights weren't filled with images of combat, but with the memory of that German officer. They relived the instant just before the trigger was pulled, the split second when things could have gone differently. This is the real face of post-traumatic stress. In the decades following the war, there wasn't really a language for this kind of pain in Canada. Society expected veterans to simply move on, to get a job, start a family, and leave the past behind. Support systems focused on physical wounds, pensions, and job training. The invisible injuries, the ones carried in the mind and soul, were largely ignored. This silence, this inability to share their stories, made the burden even heavier. Without an outlet, many soldiers were left to process these memories alone. Some began to view their actions as an unavoidable part of war, learning to live with the person they had become. But others never forgave themselves, carrying a weight of guilt even though they had followed orders and broken no laws. This shows how war doesn't just injure the body, it fundamentally reshapes a person's identity in complex and often painful ways. The goal isn't to judge what happened, but to listen. When we hear the fragmented stories of these veterans recorded decades after the events, a clear picture emerges. The fine details might be blurry, but the core emotions are sharper than ever. What truly remains isn't the enemy's face, but the crushing responsibility of having decided another person's fate. That's a burden no metal can ever lighten, a weight that stays with you for life. It's through these personal, difficult stories that Canadian society has slowly started to change how it views war and its aftermath. These morally complex experiences, once brushed aside, are now understood as a key reason why so many veterans struggle to find their place back in the civilian world. Their willingness to share forces us to confront a vital question: what is our responsibility to those who served? It's not just about supporting them during the war, but for their entire lives after. Their stories matter, their pain is real, and it's our duty to listen. Time is a funny thing. It can feel fast or slow, but it always does one thing that war never can. It helps us figure out where our memories belong. For Canada, World War II started out as a story of growing up, by young soldiers stepping out from under the British Empire's shadow to make their own mark in Europe. But in creating that big national story, some of the messier, more complicated moments got left behind. Think about it. What do you do with a memory of a German major who just wouldn't surrender? It doesn't fit neatly into a tale of clear-cut heroism. For decades after the war, Canada's official history focused on the highlights, the big battles, the obvious turning points, the symbolic wins. The Battle of Ortona, Juno Beach, liberating the Netherlands, these became legendary examples of courage and sacrifice. And those stories were important. They helped a whole country understand the real cost of freedom. The problem is, when you only focus on the epic moments, you lose sight of the smaller, more human ones. The ones where a soldier isn't just a symbol, but a person stuck between choices that all feel wrong. It wasn't until the veterans themselves started getting older that society began to worry. What if their stories disappeared with them? Suddenly, there was a new urgency to listen, really listen, to the memories that hadn't been told. Oral history projects, especially at places like the Canadian War Museum, created a space for these personal experiences to be heard, without trying to fit them into some grand, heroic narrative. In these long interviews, veterans didn't just talk about what they did. They talked about what they felt and about the things they were never quite sure were right or wrong. As these raw, personal stories started to make their way into museums, books, and documentaries, something interesting happened. Personal memory began to blend into our collective memory, but it wasn't a seamless process. It required us to accept that history isn't always neat and tidy. Acknowledging these morally gray moments doesn't make the sacrifices any less meaningful. In fact, it does the opposite. It makes them more real, more human. That story of the German major who refused to surrender. When you look at it this way, it's no longer an awkward footnote. It's a powerful example of how war pushes ordinary people into making impossible decisions. This is where history becomes a truly powerful teacher. Instead of just telling future generations that war is about winning and losing, it asks a much tougher question. What do we expect from our soldiers when every single choice they have is flawed in some way? And what's our responsibility as a society to listen to and understand the heavy burdens they carry home from the battlefield? As Canada has slowly started to embrace these complex narratives as a core part of its history, our picture of World War II has become richer and more complete. It's no longer just a story about a nation fighting against evil. It's also a story about people learning to live with the imperfect choices they had to make in incredibly imperfect situations. Stories like the face-off with that German major are just tucked away in old war diaries or national history books. They have this incredible way of seeping into the global consciousness, changing how we think about war, its rules, and the immense responsibility placed on those who hold the power of life and death. After World War II, the world had to face a harsh truth. The old rulebook just wasn't enough to handle the complex ethical minefields of modern combat. So, in the years that followed, a wave of conferences and legal debates swept across the globe, all aimed at clearing up the gray areas that soldiers on the front lines had to navigate. You had lawmakers, military lawyers, and veterans all coming together, trying to redefine what it means to surrender, to be incapacitated, or to pose an immediate threat. A situation like an enemy officer who keeps giving orders and refuses to drop his weapon became a perfect case study. When does defiance cross the line into a legitimate threat? When is using force still justified? The International Committee of the Red Cross played a huge role during this time. They used their field reports, case studies, and conversations with militaries from all over the world to drive home a critical point. The laws of war can't just be words on paper. They have to work in the real world, on the battlefield, where life or death decisions are made in a split second by people under unimaginable pressure. The experiences of Canadian soldiers and their allies weren't just stories. They became living data used to tweak and interpret the conventions to make them more practical. For the Canadian military itself, this led to real changes in training and doctrine. They started introducing these tricky, ethical scenarios into training for officers and non-commissioned officers. The goal wasn't to give them a simple list of right and wrong answers, but to train their judgment. They wanted to cultivate the ability to assess a situation, take responsibility, and understand the long-term ripple effects of their choices. The story of the German major who wouldn't surrender, while maybe not mentioned by name, echoes in these lessons. It's a quiet reminder of where the law ends and human judgment must begin. On a grander scale, these lessons helped shape how the entire world views individual responsibility in conflict. The old excuse of just following orders started to lose its power. Modern law of war puts more and more emphasis on the individual soldier's role in judging whether an action is legal and necessary. This isn't about blaming soldiers. It's about recognizing that they are not just cogs in a machine. They are moral agents, even in the most extreme circumstances. This is how a single, fleeting moment on a chaotic battlefield can send shockwaves through time and space. A decision made in the heat of battle can fuel legal debates for decades. It's through stories like this that the modern law of war, while still far from perfect, has slowly inched closer to reflecting the true nature of conflict. A realm where people are forced to make impossible choices but are still held accountable for them. It's a testament to how even the smallest acts of conscience or defiance can shape the world for generations to come. Have you ever wondered what happens to history as the people who lived it are no longer with us? As World War II fades from living memory, the question isn't just about what happened, what we should pass on to a generation that has never heard the roar of battle. Stories, like the tense standoff with a German major who refused to surrender, are now entering a second life. They're no longer just the private memories of veterans or dusty files for historians. They've become vital lessons for teaching our children about war, power, and the heavy weight of responsibility. For many years, the way we taught history was simple. Good guys on one side, bad guys on the other. Allied soldiers were often portrayed as perfect heroes. But that's starting to change as we embrace more complex, real-life stories. Educators have realized that by showing war as just a series of right versus wrong choices, we miss the most important lesson of all: understanding the immense pressure of making life-or-death decisions in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. This shift is happening right now in places like the Canadian Armed Forces military academies. Officer trainees are regularly presented with ethically gray scenarios. The goal isn't to find a single correct answer. Instead, students are forced to step into a soldier's boots to feel the pull between risk, rules, orders, and their own conscience. When the story of the defiant German officer is discussed in these classrooms, it becomes a powerful exercise. It teaches that in war, every choice, big or small, carries consequences that can ripple through a lifetime. And this isn't just happening in military schools. You can see it across our culture. Documentaries, new history books, and museum exhibits are changing how they tell these stories. They're no longer shying away from the uncomfortable moments. Instead, they're putting them front and center. This isn't about tarnishing the image of those who fought. It's about honoring their experience with honesty. It's an acknowledgement that real courage isn't about being fearless or certain. It's about acting despite the fear and doubt. True maturity, for a person and for a nation, often comes from wrestling with questions that don't have perfect, easy answers. Ultimately, this is about the moral power of storytelling. Every generation gets to choose which parts of history to highlight and which to leave in the shadows. That choice says a lot about who we are and what we value right now. When a country like Canada decides to bring these complicated stories into its classrooms and public discussions, it's making a statement. It's not just about remembering the past. It's a promise to the future. A promise that power must always be paired with responsibility, and that those who wield it must be prepared not just with skill, but with a strong moral compass. For us, watching this today, the story is more than just a historical event. It pushes us to ask a difficult, personal question. If you were in that situation, under that same pressure, what would you expect from yourself? And could you live with the fact that sometimes, doing what's necessary doesn't bring peace, but a lifetime of reflection. At the end of the film, the story doesn't lead us to victory or defeat. It brings us back to where it all began, a moment of human choice made in circumstances that forbid perfection. The German major refused to surrender. The Canadian soldiers acted to protect their comrades and fulfill their mission. Decades later, history offers no final moral judgment for that moment. And it's this silence that carries the story's most powerful message. War is often portrayed as a clear chain of cause and effect, where every action leads to victory, and that victory gives it meaning. But this story shows us that war operates on a much deeper level, a level where cause and effect are no longer aligned. Decisions might be legal, they might be militarily sound, but they still leave a heavy weight on the human soul. History doesn't erase that impact, it just places it in a broader context so we can learn to confront it. After World War II, the world tried to build legal and ethical frameworks to prevent such moments from happening again, or at least to give people more tools to deal with them. International institutions, from the United Nations to the Geneva Conventions, all bear the mark of incomplete stories, just like this one. They don't promise that war will ever be humane, but they do acknowledge that as long as war exists, humanity must constantly strive to limit the price it demands. The most profound social lesson here isn't about who was right or wrong. It's about how we see those who are forced to make the choice. When a society asks its soldiers to make sacrifices, it also has to accept the responsibility of listening to their stories when they return, especially when those stories are uncomfortable. Remembering war with honesty doesn't weaken our collective memory. On the contrary, it makes that memory more mature, less idealistic, and far more humane. From an educational standpoint, this story is a powerful reminder. The ultimate goal of learning history isn't just to memorize dates and events. It's to develop the ability to think ethically in complex situations. When future generations see that the Canadian soldiers weren't just perfect symbols, but real human beings who bore the weight of their decisions, they'll understand the true value of peace. Peace then stops being an abstract idea and becomes something precious, a state that frees people from ever having to make such choices. The film ends slowly, not to glorify war, but to reveal its true nature. History doesn't exist to make us feel comfortable. It's here to challenge us. The story of the Canadian soldiers and the German major doesn't offer a simple, happy conclusion. Instead, it gives us something far more important: the understanding that even in the most extreme circumstances, people are accountable for their actions, and society has a responsibility to remember those actions with honesty and compassion. As the credits roll, there's no grand call to arms, no epic fanfare. There's just a quiet but persistent question left for each of us. If history put us in that same situation, would we have the courage to make a decision and the humility to live with the consequences?